Welcome back to Background Historian. Apologies for the absence the past few days. Today we are back with an exciting and encapsulating episode that will cover the entire period of the Enlightenment. While most of us learned about this period briefly growing up, tonight we will take a deep dive into the ins and outs of what it meant for someone to live during the Enlightenment. Relax, close your eyes, and dim the lights as we take a stroll down this enriching part of history. Part 1: The Dawn of the Enlightenment, a world ready for change. Long before the Enlightenment was given a name, Europe was a continent at a crossroads. The 17th century had been a time of upheaval, wars of religion had torn nations apart, monarchs claimed absolute power, and the old structures of authority, church and crown, seemed unshakable. Yet beneath the surface, curiosity was stirring. It began with questions. Questions whispered in universities, in coffee houses, and in the writings of bold thinkers. Could reason, not tradition, guide humanity? Could individuals think for themselves, rather than bow to authority? The seeds of the Enlightenment were planted during the scientific revolution of the 1500s and 1600s, when figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton rewrote humanity's understanding of the cosmos. The Earth was no longer the unmoving center of the universe, it was one planet among many. The heavens, once thought divine, now moved according to laws of physics. These discoveries did more than change astronomy. They changed how people saw knowledge itself. If nature could be explained by reason, perhaps society, politics, and morality could as well. The Enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason, would stretch across the late 17th and 18th centuries. It was not a single movement, but a constellation of ideas that spread across Europe and into the Americas, touching philosophy, politics, science, economics, and art. It was a time when men and women dared to imagine a world governed not by kings or dogma, but by human reason and universal rights. And though not every promise of the Enlightenment would be fulfilled, its impact would shape the modern world. The dawn had broken. The Age of Reason was about to rise. Part 2: The Roots of the Enlightenment, Science, Faith, and Reason. To understand the Enlightenment, we must look back to the centuries before it. For much of European history, truth was defined by tradition. The Church explained the universe, monarchs ruled by divine right, and scholars relied on the writings of ancient authorities. But by the 1600s, the ground was shifting. The scientific revolution as a foundation. The scientific revolution laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Nicholas Copernicus had dared to say the Earth moved around the Sun, overturning centuries of belief. Galileo Galilei, peering through his telescope, confirmed moons orbiting Jupiter and saw imperfections on the Sun, proof that the heavens were not flawless. Then came Isaac Newton, whose Principia Mathematica, 1687, described laws of motion and gravity that explained the universe in mathematical terms. Newton's work suggested that nature itself was orderly, governed by laws that could be discovered through reason. For many, this was a revelation. If the universe ran on principles that human minds could uncover, perhaps everything, government, justice, morality, could be re-examined. Religion and the question of authority. Religion remained central, yet the Enlightenment began to question the absolute authority of the Church. Some thinkers embraced deism, the belief that God created the universe but did not interfere with its workings, like a watchmaker winding a clock and letting it run. This idea allowed reason and faith to coexist without constant conflict. A divine creator had established natural laws, but it was up to humanity to study them and live by them. Coffeehouses, salons, and the spread of ideas. Knowledge no longer belonged only to scholars and priests. Across Europe, coffeehouses in London and salons in Paris became the engines of intellectual exchange. Ordinary citizens, writers, and philosophers debated politics, religion, and science over cups of coffee. For the first time, books and pamphlets were becoming affordable thanks to the printing press. Ideas could travel faster, reaching a wider audience than ever before. The spirit of inquiry. The heart of this new age was curiosity. Could monarchy be questioned? Could the natural rights of human beings be defined? Could societies be built on principles of reason instead of fear? The Enlightenment did not begin as a revolution. It began as a conversation. A conversation that grew louder with each passing decade, until it reshaped the world itself. Part 3: The Philosophes, Voices of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was not a single event, but a chorus of voices, writers, philosophers, and reformers who dared to question the old order and imagine something new. In France, they came to be known as the Philosophes, but their influence stretched far beyond Europe. Voltaire, champion of liberty. One of the most famous was Voltaire, a sharp-witted writer and critic. He attacked intolerance, superstition, and the abuses of church and monarchy with biting satire. Voltaire believed in freedom of speech and religion, famously declaring, through paraphrase, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." His works were banned and burned, yet they circulated widely, inspiring countless readers to challenge authority. Montesquieu, the balance of power. Another towering figure was Baron de Montesquieu, whose Spirit of the Laws, 1748, introduced the idea of separation of powers in government. He argued that tyranny could only be prevented if political power was divided among different branches. His ideas would later deeply influence the U.S. Constitution. Rousseau, the social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that true freedom could only be found in a community governed by the general will. In The Social Contract, 1762, he wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." His vision was radical, arguing that sovereignty belonged not to kings, but to the people themselves. Diderot, the Encyclopedia. Denis Diderot undertook a bold project, compiling all human knowledge into one massive work, the Encyclopedia. This monumental collection of volumes sought to spread Enlightenment ideas to the widest audience possible. Though censored by the authorities, it became one of the greatest tools of intellectual change. Locke and Hobbes, the English Voices. Across the Channel, English thinkers laid important foundations. John Locke argued that all people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments existed to protect these rights. Thomas Hobbes, more cautious, believed humans were naturally selfish and needed strong authority, but even he introduced the idea of a social contract between rulers and the ruled. The rise of public opinion. For the first time, public opinion became a powerful force. The writings of the Philosophes circulated in pamphlets, newspapers, and books, shaping debates not just in elite circles but among ordinary citizens. The Philosophes were not all alike. Some were radical, others cautious. Some believed in equality, while others still clung to privilege. Yet together, they formed the beating heart of the Enlightenment, a movement that placed reason, freedom, and human dignity at the center of human life. Part 4: Science and Discovery, Unlocking Nature's Secrets. The Enlightenment was more than philosophy. It was also an age of discovery, where men and women sought to unlock the mysteries of the natural world. Science was no longer confined to cloistered studies or royal courts, it became a shared human pursuit, reshaping how people understood the universe and their place within it. The legacy of Newton. Isaac Newton's laws of motion and gravity were the cornerstone of Enlightenment science. His work suggested that the universe operated like a vast machine, governed by laws that reason and mathematics could uncover. Newton's ideas fueled the belief that human reason could explain not just the heavens, but society itself. Astronomy and the heavens. Building on Newton, astronomers mapped the skies with increasing precision. Telescopes revealed moons, planets, and stars with astonishing clarity. The notion of a divine, unchanging cosmos gave way to the idea of a universe vast, dynamic, and governed by natural laws. Medicine and the human body. The Enlightenment also brought advances in medicine. Physicians began to challenge old ideas based on superstition and the four humors. Instead, they turned to observation, dissection, and experimentation. William Harvey's discovery of blood circulation earlier in the century inspired further study, while smallpox inoculation, pioneered in part by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, offered new hope against deadly disease. Chemistry and the nature of matter. Chemists like Antoine Lavoisier transformed the study of matter. He identified and named oxygen and hydrogen, established the role of combustion, and helped create the modern system of chemical nomenclature. Known as the father of modern chemistry, Lavoisier embodied the Enlightenment spirit of careful observation and rational explanation. Exploration and natural history. The Enlightenment was also an age of exploration. European voyages mapped coastlines, rivers, and continents. Naturalists like Carl Linnaeus developed systems to classify plants and animals, bringing order to the dazzling diversity of the natural world. The democratization of knowledge. Crucially, scientific discoveries were no longer confined to elites. Books, pamphlets, and lectures brought new knowledge to a wider public. Coffee houses hosted scientific demonstrations, and societies dedicated to natural philosophy welcomed curious minds. The Enlightenment taught people not only that the universe was knowable, but that it was their right to know it. Science was not simply about discovery, it was about empowerment. Part 5: Religion and the Enlightenment, Faith, Doubt, and Deism. The Enlightenment was not a rejection of faith, but a reimagining of it. For centuries, religion had been the anchor of European life, shaping laws, governments, and moral codes. But as reason and science advanced, many thinkers began to ask, what role should religion play in a rational world? The decline of absolute authority. For much of the Middle Ages, the Church had been the primary source of truth. To question it was heresy. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, wars of religion had left Europe weary of sectarian violence. Thinkers argued that religion should be a personal matter, not the basis of political authority. Deism, the watchmaker god. A popular Enlightenment view became deism, which held that God created the universe but did not interfere in its workings. To deists, God was a watchmaker, setting the universe in motion according to natural laws, then stepping back. This allowed belief in a creator while freeing people from rigid doctrines and dogmas. Many leading Enlightenment figures, including Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, leaned toward deism. Religious toleration. Thinkers like Voltaire championed religious tolerance, arguing that diversity of belief was not a threat but a strength. In his treatise on tolerance, Voltaire wrote passionately against fanaticism and the persecution of minorities. The Enlightenment helped inspire policies of tolerance in many nations, reducing the power of established churches and granting more freedom to dissenting faiths. Challenges to orthodoxy. At the same time, more radical critics emerged. Some began to question miracles, the literal interpretation of Scripture, and even the existence of God. These ideas were controversial, and many works were banned or published anonymously. Faith and reason combined. Yet the Enlightenment did not erase religion. For many, faith and reason were complementary. They believed that studying the natural world was a way to honor God's creation, and that morality could be grounded in both divine principles and human reason. The legacy. The Enlightenment did not settle the debate between faith and reason, it transformed it. Religion remained central to life, but its role shifted. It became increasingly a matter of personal conscience, while governments and societies began to move towards secular principles. The conversation about faith, reason, and freedom that began in the Enlightenment continues to shape the modern world. Part 6: Politics and Power, the Enlightenment and Government. The Enlightenment was not only about ideas of science and philosophy, it was about the very structure of human society. Perhaps nowhere was its influence more profound than in the realm of politics. For centuries, Europe had been dominated by absolute monarchies, rulers who claimed their authority came directly from God. Kings and queens commanded armies, levied taxes, and dictated laws with little regard for the consent of the governed. But the Enlightenment began to challenge this old order. John Locke and the Social Contract. John Locke, an English philosopher, became one of the most influential political thinkers of the era. In his two treatises of government, 1689, Locke argued that people were born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that governments existed only to protect those rights. If a government failed to do so, Locke said, the people had the right to overthrow it. This was a radical departure from the divine right of kings. Montesquieu and the separation of powers. Baron de Montesquieu, a French philosopher, advanced another groundbreaking idea in the spirit of the laws, 1748. He believed that political power should be divided among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. This separation of powers would prevent tyranny by ensuring no single group or ruler could dominate. His ideas later became the foundation for the U.S. Constitution. Rousseau and the General Will. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in The Social Contract, 1762, pushed the idea even further. He argued that sovereignty should lie with the general will of the people, not monarchs or elites. Though his vision was idealistic and controversial, it inspired revolutionaries who dreamed of a government built on popular consent. Enlightened despotism. Not all rulers resisted Enlightenment ideas. Some monarchs, known as enlightened despots, embraced reform while maintaining absolute control. Frederick the Great of Prussia modernized laws and promoted education. Catherine the Great of Russia corresponded with Voltaire and supported cultural growth. Joseph II of Austria issued reforms on religious tolerance and serfdom. These rulers believed they could govern more effectively by applying reason, though many reforms were limited or later undone. The seeds of revolution. By challenging the notion that kings ruled by divine right, Enlightenment political philosophy planted the seeds of revolution. The American and French revolutions would soon turn these ideas into action, reshaping the political world forever. The Enlightenment taught humanity that power should not be inherited without question, but earned through justice, law, and the consent of the governed. Part 7: Economics and Society, Wealth, Work, and Reason. The Enlightenment did not only reshape politics and philosophy, it also transformed how people thought about wealth, labor, and the structure of society. For centuries, economies had been guided by tradition, guild rules, and mercantilist policies. But now, thinkers began asking, could reason guide economics just as it guided science and government? The decline of mercantilism. For much of the 1600s and early 1700s, European nations followed mercantilism, the belief that national strength came from stockpiling gold and controlling trade through colonies and tariffs. But Enlightenment thinkers criticized this approach as too rigid and destructive. They argued that wealth was not fixed, like a pie to be divided, but could grow if trade was free and fair. Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. Perhaps the most influential economic thinker of the Enlightenment was Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher. In 1776, he published The Wealth of Nations, which laid the foundation for modern economics. Smith argued for the invisible hand of the market. When individuals pursued their own self-interest, they unintentionally promoted the prosperity of society as a whole. He supported free trade, competition, and limited government interference in the economy. His ideas were revolutionary, challenging the mercantilist system and shaping capitalism for centuries to come. New views on labor and class. The Enlightenment also began to question the rigid social hierarchies of Europe. The feudal system, in which peasants worked the land for aristocrats, was increasingly criticized as unjust and inefficient. Philosophers like Rousseau wrote passionately about inequality, arguing that while people were born free, society's structures had chained them. Enlightenment salons and pamphlets spread debates about whether birth should determine one's opportunities, or whether merit, talent, and reason should. Slavery and commerce. The Enlightenment era also saw the rise of debates over slavery. While some Enlightenment thinkers defended it as an economic necessity, others condemned it as a violation of natural rights. Figures like Voltaire and Condorcet denounced the slave trade, and abolitionist movements began to take root, especially in Britain and later in America. The contradiction between Enlightenment ideals of liberty and the existence of slavery would remain one of the age's deepest ironies. Everyday life and consumption. As trade expanded, so too did the availability of goods like sugar, tea, coffee, and cotton. The Enlightenment was also a consumer revolution. Ordinary families could now buy items that had once been luxuries. Coffee houses became meeting places not only for intellectuals but for merchants and workers, blending social classes in new ways. Toward modern economics. The Enlightenment did not solve every question of wealth and poverty, but it reframed the conversation. No longer was the economy seen as a mystery guided only by kings and merchants. It was a system that reason could study, shape, and, perhaps, improve. Part 8: Art, Literature, and the Culture of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was not confined to politics, science, or economics. It also reshaped art, literature, and culture. Ideas of reason, balance, and human dignity found expression in paintings, novels, architecture, and music. The Age of Reason was as much about beauty and creativity as it was about philosophy. The rise of neoclassicism. In art and architecture, the Enlightenment favored neoclassicism, a style inspired by the symmetry and simplicity of ancient Greece and Rome. Where earlier styles like the Baroque and Rococo had been ornate and dramatic, neoclassicism reflected Enlightenment ideals of order, proportion, and rational design. Buildings such as the Pantheon in Paris and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Virginia embodied this classical revival. Artists like Jacques-Louis David painted powerful works that linked contemporary politics with classical ideals, such as the Oath of the Horatii. Literature as a voice of reason. The Enlightenment also transformed literature. Writers no longer limited themselves to tales of nobility or legend. They turned their attention to human experience, satire, and social critique. Voltaire's Candide mocked blind optimism and religious hypocrisy. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels used satire to expose the follies of politics and human nature. Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie was itself a literary monument, a vast collection of essays meant to spread knowledge to all. Novels began to flourish as a new form of storytelling, capturing the lives of ordinary people. Authors like Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding in England pioneered the modern novel, while later, writers like Goethe in Germany wove philosophy into narrative. Music in the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment also shaped music, favoring clarity, balance, and emotional depth. The period gave rise to some of history's greatest composers. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whose operas and symphonies combined technical brilliance with emotional beauty. Joseph Haydn, often called the father of the symphony. Ludwig van Beethoven, who bridged the Enlightenment with the Romantic era, infusing music with passion and revolutionary spirit. Music became more accessible to the public, performed in salons and concert halls rather than only at royal courts. The salon culture. The Enlightenment thrived in salons, gatherings often hosted by educated women in their homes. Figures like Madame Geoffrin in Paris welcomed philosophers, scientists, and artists to exchange ideas over conversation, music, and readings. These salons were more than social gatherings, they were engines of cultural and intellectual life, spreading ideas beyond universities and courts. A world of ideas made beautiful. Art, literature, and music during the Enlightenment were not simply entertainment. They were tools of education, persuasion, and expression. They reflected the belief that reason and beauty together could elevate the human spirit and create a better world. Part 9: The Enlightenment and Education, Spreading Knowledge. The Enlightenment was not only a revolution of ideas, but also a revolution in how those ideas were shared. If reason was to improve humanity, knowledge could not remain locked away in universities or the libraries of the wealthy. It had to be accessible to all. The printing press and the explosion of books. The printing press, invented centuries earlier, now fueled a cultural explosion. By the 18th century, books, pamphlets, and newspapers circulated on an unprecedented scale. Literacy rates rose, especially in towns and cities, as reading became both a tool of education and a form of leisure. Philosophers published essays, scientists shared discoveries, and novelists reached audiences who had never before held a book of their own. Ideas that once might have been confined to elite scholars now flowed into the homes of tradesmen, artisans, and merchants. The Encyclopedia. One of the greatest monuments to Enlightenment education was Denis Diderot's Encyclopedia, a massive collection of essays written by leading intellectuals of the time. Its goal was simple yet radical: to gather all human knowledge and make it available to the public. The encyclopedia included not just philosophy and science, but practical information about crafts, agriculture, and medicine. It was banned more than once for its controversial ideas, yet its volumes continued to circulate, shaping the minds of a generation. Academies and scientific societies. The Enlightenment also gave rise to learned societies and academies, where scientists and thinkers gathered to share knowledge. In London, the Royal Society became a hub of scientific exchange. In Paris, academies sponsored essays, lectures, and competitions that encouraged new discoveries. These institutions created networks of knowledge that transcended borders, making the Enlightenment a truly international movement. Schools and universities. Education itself was reimagined. Enlightenment thinkers argued that learning should be available to more than just the elite. New schools were founded, and in some countries, efforts began to create more widespread systems of public education. Philosophers like John Locke emphasized the importance of education in shaping character and reason. He argued that the human mind was a blank slate, shaped by experience, a radical idea that gave new weight to the value of schooling. Knowledge as a tool of freedom. At its heart, Enlightenment education was about empowerment. Knowledge was not just for the sake of curiosity, it was a tool to challenge ignorance, tyranny, and superstition. The idea that every person had the right to learn became one of the Enlightenment's most enduring legacies. It paved the way for public education systems and the belief that education was essential to both personal and civic freedom. Part 10: The Enlightenment and Women, Voices in the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment championed reason, liberty, and equality, yet for many women, these promises remained out of reach. Still, the era marked a turning point. Women began to question their place in society, demand education, and carve out intellectual spaces where their voices could be heard. Salons, the heart of debate. Many of the Enlightenment's greatest discussions took place in salons, gatherings often organized and hosted by women. Figures like Madame Geoffrin in Paris, Madame de Staël, and Julie de Lespinasse welcomed philosophers, scientists, and artists into their homes. These salons became hubs of Enlightenment culture, where men and women alike debated philosophy, politics, and science. Without these women, many Enlightenment ideas might never have spread so widely. Women as writers and thinkers. Some women went beyond hosting, they became intellectual leaders themselves. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, boldly argued that women deserved the same education as men and should be treated as rational beings. Émilie du Châtelet, a mathematician and physicist, translated and expanded Isaac Newton's works, making them accessible to French readers and shaping scientific thought. Olympe de Gouges later wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen during the French Revolution, challenging the exclusion of women from Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. Education for girls. The Enlightenment sparked debates about the education of women. Traditionally, girls were taught domestic skills but denied formal schooling. Reformers argued that educating women was essential for raising enlightened citizens, since mothers shaped the minds of the next generation. Though progress was slow, these arguments laid the groundwork for later reforms in women's education. The contradictions of the age. Despite these advances, most Enlightenment philosophers still clung to traditional views of gender. Rousseau, for instance, praised liberty but insisted that women's primary role was as wives and mothers. The ideals of reason and equality often stopped at the threshold of the home. A legacy of seeds planted. Even with its contradictions, the Enlightenment marked the beginning of a shift. Women's voices could no longer be ignored, and their contributions to science, philosophy, and literature became undeniable. The Age of Reason may not have fully delivered equality, but it planted the seeds of a struggle that would grow into the women's rights movements of later centuries. Part 11: The Enlightenment and Revolution, America's Birth of Liberty. The Enlightenment was more than philosophy, it was fuel for revolution. Nowhere was this clearer than in the 13 colonies of North America, where Enlightenment ideals became the backbone of a movement for independence. Seeds of revolution. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies thrived economically but remained under British rule. As Britain sought more revenue through taxes like the Stamp Act and Tea Act, colonists began to argue not just against unfair taxation, but for the deeper principle of liberty. Enlightenment thinkers provided the language and logic for their cause. John Locke's ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, inspired colonial leaders to argue that governments must protect these rights, or lose their legitimacy. The notion of the social contract made clear that power should come from the people, not from monarchs across the sea. The Declaration of Independence. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson, deeply influenced by Locke and other philosophers, drafted the Declaration of Independence. Its famous words declared that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. It was a bold proclamation that authority came not from kings, but from the will of the people. A new experiment in government. The Revolutionary War tested these ideals in practice. After victory, the United States faced the challenge of building a government worthy of the Enlightenment's promises. The U.S. Constitution of 1787 drew heavily from Enlightenment thought. Montesquieu's separation of powers shaped the three-branch system of government. Locke's defense of natural rights influenced the Bill of Rights, ensuring freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly. Rousseau's emphasis on the people's sovereignty guided the belief that legitimate power must rest with citizens. The global impact. The American Revolution was not only a national triumph, it was a beacon to the world. It proved that Enlightenment principles could move beyond words and shape a functioning republic. Across Europe and beyond, reformers and revolutionaries drew inspiration from the new United States. Liberty's promise and contradictions. Yet the American Revolution carried contradictions. Slavery remained entrenched, and women and native peoples were excluded from the new republic's freedoms. The Enlightenment had planted the seeds of liberty, but the harvest would be slow and uneven. Still, the Revolution marked a turning point in human history, a bold step toward the Enlightenment vision of government based on reason, justice, and the rights of all. Part 12: The French Revolution, Reason Meets Revolution. If the American Revolution was the Enlightenment's first great political triumph, the French Revolution would become its most dramatic, and most turbulent, test. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it began with high hopes for reform but soon descended into upheaval, terror, and transformation. Seeds of discontent. By the late 1700s, France was a nation of contradictions. The Enlightenment flourished in Parisian salons, yet the vast majority of people lived in poverty while a privileged nobility and clergy enjoyed immense wealth. The monarchy, under Louis XVI, faced crushing debt, worsened by its support for the American Revolution. At the same time, Enlightenment thinkers had spread the idea that sovereignty should belong to the people, not the crown. The storm breaks. In 1789, the king called the Estates General, a meeting of France's three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners. Frustrated by inequality, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming the right to represent the people. Soon after, Paris erupted. On July 14, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille, a prison symbolizing royal tyranny. The fall of the Bastille became the revolution's defining moment. Enlightenment ideals in action. The revolutionaries moved quickly to enshrine Enlightenment principles. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity as the rights of all men. Inspired by Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, it called for an end to feudal privilege and the sovereignty of the people. The Reign of Terror. But the revolution soon turned violent. Radical leaders like Maximilien Robespierre took power, determined to purge enemies of the revolution. Under the Committee of Public Safety, thousands were executed by guillotine, including the king and queen. What had begun as a movement for reason and liberty spiraled into fear and bloodshed, showing both the power and peril of Enlightenment ideals when pushed to extremes. Napoleon and the legacy. By the late 1790s, the revolution had exhausted itself. Out of the chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized power and crowned himself emperor. Though he ruled as a dictator, Napoleon carried forward many Enlightenment reforms. A legal code guaranteeing equality before the law, merit-based government service, and religious toleration. A world forever changed. The French Revolution left a mixed legacy. It toppled an ancient monarchy and spread the dream of equality, but it also showed how quickly liberty could give way to violence. Still, its ideas of rights, sovereignty, and justice reverberated across Europe and the Americas, shaping revolutions and reforms for generations. The Enlightenment had met revolution, and the world would never be the same. Part 13, The Enlightenment Beyond Europe, Global Ripples. Though the Enlightenment began in the salons of Paris, the coffeehouses of London, and the universities of Europe, its ideas did not remain confined to the continent. The Age of Reason rippled outward, touching the Americas, Africa, and Asia, shaping revolutions, reforms, and resistance around the world. The Americas and the birth of republics. The American Revolution was the first great child of the Enlightenment, but it was not the last. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Enlightenment ideals fueled the independence movements across Latin America. Leaders like Simón Bolívar in South America drew directly on the principles of liberty, equality, and the rights of men. Bolívar, sometimes called the George Washington of South America, dreamed of free republics across the continent, inspired by the same Enlightenment philosophers who had shaped the United States. Haiti and the fight for freedom. Perhaps the most radical Enlightenment revolution occurred in Haiti, then the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Inspired by the French Revolution's promises of liberty, enslaved Africans rose in 1791 under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. It became the only successful slave revolt in history, leading to Haiti's independence in 1804. The Haitian Revolution embodied the Enlightenment's ideals more fully than any European revolution, but it also revealed the limits of European thinkers, many of whom failed to support equality for enslaved peoples. Asia and Africa, encounters with Enlightenment. In Asia, Enlightenment ideas spread more slowly, carried by trade, missionaries, and colonial encounters. While European powers often imposed control rather than liberty, concepts of science, education, and reform found audiences in places like India and China, where intellectuals began blending Enlightenment reason with their own traditions. In Africa, Enlightenment debates about slavery had profound consequences. Abolitionist movements in Europe, shaped by Enlightenment ideas of human rights, slowly gained strength. Though the slave trade continued into the 19th century, the Enlightenment helped provide the moral and intellectual foundation for its eventual abolition. The universal language of reason. Even where political revolutions did not occur, Enlightenment ideals changed the way people thought about themselves and their governments. Education, science, and rational inquiry began to spread as universal values. The idea that human dignity transcended borders was one of the Enlightenment's most powerful legacies. A global awakening. The Enlightenment was not only a European phenomenon. It was a global wave, uneven and often contradictory, but one that reshaped the very conversation about freedom, power, and human possibility across the world. Part 14, Enlightenment Science and Technology, Tools of Progress. The Enlightenment was a time when human curiosity met human ingenuity. Not only did thinkers seek to explain the universe, they also sought to harness knowledge to improve daily life. Science and technology became practical tools of progress, shaping how people lived, worked, and understood the world. The scientific spirit. At the heart of Enlightenment science was the belief that nature operated according to laws that could be observed, measured, and explained. Experimentation replaced superstition, and evidence replaced authority. Scientific societies like the Royal Society in London and the Academy of Sciences in Paris provided platforms for discovery, encouraging collaboration across borders. Medicine and public health. Advances in medicine were slow but important. The practice of inoculation against smallpox spread, reducing deaths from one of history's deadliest diseases. Physicians increasingly emphasized observation and anatomy rather than ancient theories of the body's humors. Hospitals and medical schools expanded, making healthcare more organized and systematic. Chemistry and physics. The 18th century saw groundbreaking progress in the sciences of matter and energy. Antoine Lavoisier, often called the father of modern chemistry, identified and named oxygen and hydrogen, helping to create the basis of modern chemistry. Studies of electricity by figures like Benjamin Franklin and Alessandro Volta opened new frontiers in understanding natural forces. Isaac Newton's legacy in physics continued to inspire experimentation and new discoveries. Agriculture and industry. The Enlightenment also touched the land itself. Agricultural reforms introduced new crops, crop rotation systems, and improved tools, increasing food production. In Britain especially, these changes laid the foundations for the coming Industrial Revolution, where reason and innovation would transform entire economies. Technology for everyday life. Inventions of the Enlightenment were not confined to laboratories. The steam engine, developed further by James Watt in the late 1700s, promised new power for transportation and industry. Advances in navigation and cartography improved global trade and exploration. Printing technology became more efficient, fueling the spread of books and ideas. Knowledge for all. What made Enlightenment science truly revolutionary was its accessibility. Scientific lectures and demonstrations were often open to the public. Coffee houses hosted talks on electricity, astronomy, and mechanics, turning learning into community events. Science was no longer the domain of a few, it was B. Part 15, Enlightenment Art and Music, Harmony of Reason and Beauty. The Enlightenment was not only a revolution of thought but also a revolution of culture. Art, architecture, and music reflected the new values of reason, balance, and human dignity, blending intellectual ideals with aesthetic beauty. The rise of neoclassicism. During the Enlightenment, neoclassicism emerged as the dominant artistic style. Inspired by the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman ruins, artists and architects turned away from the elaborate curves of the Baroque and Rococo styles. Neoclassical works emphasized order, symmetry, and simplicity, mirroring Enlightenment ideals of clarity and reason. In architecture, buildings like the U.S. Capitol and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello showcased Greco-Roman columns and rational design. In painting, Jacques-Louis David became the leading figure, with works like The Oath of the Horatii capturing civic virtue and moral seriousness. Portraiture and everyday life. Art also shifted to reflect ordinary people, not just royalty or religious figures. Portraits of merchants, scientists, and philosophers became popular, highlighting the growing respect for reason and achievement outside of aristocracy. Literature in the Age of Reason. Literature during the Enlightenment sought to instruct as well as entertain. Voltaire's Candide skewered optimism and dogma through biting satire. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels lampooned politics and human folly with wit and imagination. Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie, though not a novel, was itself a literary achievement, spreading knowledge to a mass audience. The novel as a form flourished. Writers like Samuel Richardson, Pamela, and Henry Fielding, Tom Jones, gave readers stories that explored morality, society, and the human condition. Music, the age of the symphony. Music blossomed in the Enlightenment, moving from the courts of kings to public concert halls. It was an age of elegance, harmony, and balance. Joseph Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, established the foundations of modern orchestral music. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart dazzled Europe with operas and symphonies filled with clarity, grace, and human emotion. Ludwig van Beethoven, bridging Enlightenment ideals with romantic passion, gave music new depth and power. Music became more accessible than ever before. Public concerts allowed ordinary citizens, not just nobles, to hear great works. The salon as cultural hub. Art and music often thrived in salons, where intellectual debate mingled with performances and readings. These gatherings brought together philosophers, artists, and musicians in lively exchange, spreading Enlightenment culture far beyond universities and courts. Beauty meets reason. The art and music of the Enlightenment embodied the belief that beauty and reason belonged together. Whether in the measured columns of a building, the clarity of a symphony, or the sharp wit of a satirical novel, culture became a mirror of the Enlightenment spirit, rational, elegant, and profoundly human. Part 16: Enlightenment and the Public Sphere, Coffeehouses, Clubs, and Salons. The Enlightenment was not confined to dusty libraries or royal courts. It lived and breathed in public spaces where ordinary citizens gathered to talk, debate, and share ideas. These places, coffeehouses, clubs, and salons, were the heart of the new public sphere, where knowledge and reason became part of daily life. The Coffeehouse Revolution. In London, Paris, and other European cities, the coffeehouse became known as the Penny University. For the price of a cup of coffee, anyone could sit, listen, and join conversations about science, politics, philosophy, and literature. Coffeehouses attracted merchants, artisans, and professionals, creating a melting pot of classes. Newspapers and pamphlets were often available, spreading the latest Enlightenment writings. Some coffeehouses specialized. One might focus on science, another on politics, another on trade. The coffeehouse gave rise to the idea that public debate was not just for the elite, but for all who could engage in reasoned conversation. The salon, intellectual gatherings of the elite. While coffeehouses catered largely to men of the middle classes, the salon became a hub for the aristocracy and the educated elite. Hosted often by influential women, salons brought together philosophers, writers, scientists, and artists. Madame Geoffrin, one of the most famous salonières in Paris, hosted gatherings that included Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu. Salons allowed women, often excluded from universities, to shape intellectual debate by setting agendas and fostering discussions. Clubs and learned societies. In addition to salons and coffeehouses, new clubs and societies flourished. Scientific clubs, like the Royal Society in London, brought together experimenters to share discoveries. Reading clubs and debating societies allowed ordinary citizens to engage with Enlightenment texts. Freemason lodges spread across Europe, blending social fraternity with Enlightenment ideals of reason, brotherhood, and moral improvement. Newspapers and pamphlets. The explosion of print culture fueled the public sphere. Pamphlets, essays, and newspapers carried debates far beyond the cities, reaching rural readers and spreading Enlightenment ideals across borders. The birth of public opinion. For the first time in history, public opinion became a political force. Kings and governments could no longer ignore what was said in the salons and coffeehouses, for these conversations shaped the mood of entire nations. The Enlightenment public sphere was not just about ideas, it was about community, dialogue, and the growing belief that knowledge belonged to all. Part 17. The Enlightenment and Law, Justice, Rights, and Reform. The Enlightenment was an age not only of science and philosophy but also of profound rethinking about law, justice, and human rights. For centuries, laws had often served the powerful, monarchs, aristocrats, and religious authorities. Punishments could be cruel, arbitrary, and public. But Enlightenment thinkers began to ask, could justice be guided by reason, fairness, and humanity? From cruelty to rational justice. Before the Enlightenment, punishments were often severe, public executions, torture, and branding were common. Trials could be secretive, evidence unreliable, and punishments wildly disproportionate. Philosophers of the Enlightenment argued that justice should not be about vengeance but about deterrence, fairness, and rehabilitation. Cesare Beccaria and the Call for Reform. One of the most influential voices was Cesare Beccaria, an Italian philosopher. In his landmark work on Crimes and Punishments, 1764, Beccaria condemned torture and the death penalty, arguing that punishments should be proportionate to the crime and designed to prevent further harm. Beccaria's ideas spread quickly across Europe and the Americas, influencing criminal law reforms and even the U.S. Bill of Rights. Natural rights and the law. The concept of natural rights, championed by John Locke and others, transformed legal thinking. If every person was born with rights to life, liberty, and property, then the law's duty was to protect those rights, not to strip them away at the whim of rulers. This idea laid the foundation for constitutional protections, human rights declarations, and the modern principle of the rule of law. Montesquieu and the separation of powers. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu argued that justice could only thrive if power was divided among different branches of government. His vision of separation of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, became a cornerstone of Enlightenment legal thought and heavily influenced the U.S. Constitution. Trials and legal equality. The Enlightenment also pushed the idea that all citizens should be equal before the law, regardless of birth or social rank. While true equality was far from realized, the principle challenged the privileges of aristocracy and clergy, setting the stage for revolutionary change. A legacy that endures. Though many Enlightenment reforms were slow to take root, their legacy reshaped the world. Modern justice systems, with their emphasis on due process, fair trials, and human rights, owe much to the debates of this era. The Enlightenment taught that justice was not a tool of rulers but a safeguard of human dignity. Part 18, The Enlightenment and Revolution in Thought, Radical Ideas that Changed the World. The Enlightenment was not just a period of refined debate. It was a period of radical ideas that shook the foundations of authority and tradition. Some of these ideas were so bold that they seemed dangerous to the old order. Yet they spread, sparking revolutions both political and intellectual, challenging monarchy and divine right. For centuries, kings ruled by divine right, claiming their authority came directly from God. Enlightenment thinkers shattered this belief. Philosophers like John Locke argued that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed, not from heaven. This idea, that rulers were accountable to the people, was revolutionary, paving the way for constitutional monarchies and republics. Questioning social hierarchies. Europe's traditional order divided people into estates, nobility, clergy, and commoners. The Enlightenment challenged the notion that birth determined one's place in society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau insisted that sovereignty lay with the people. Voltaire ridiculed the privileges of aristocrats and clerics. The idea of meritocracy, that ability, not birth, should determine status, began to take hold. Liberty of conscience and religion. Enlightenment thinkers boldly defended freedom of religion in an age when dissent could mean persecution. Voltaire famously declared, "Écrasez l'infâme." Crush the infamous thing. Referring to intolerance and superstition. This insistence on religious toleration was radical in a Europe still scarred by wars of religion. Expanding the idea of human rights. Though far from universal, the Enlightenment began to articulate rights that extended beyond elites. The belief that all men were created equal, proclaimed in the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, was a bold step toward modern human rights. Abolitionist ideas take root. While the Enlightenment was often blind to its own contradictions, especially regarding slavery, it also gave birth to early abolitionist movements. Thinkers like Condorcet in France and Granville Sharp in Britain began to argue that slavery violated the principles of liberty and human dignity. Education as a tool of freedom. Radicals also argued that education should be universal, so that every citizen could reason for themselves. This directly challenged the old order, which relied on ignorance to maintain control. The power of the printed word. Pamphlets, newspapers, and books carried these radical ideas to the masses. What began in salons and academies soon reached farmers, merchants, and soldiers. Public opinion, once unthinkable as a force in politics, became a revolutionary power. A world reimagined. The Enlightenment's radical ideas did not just seek reform, they sought transformation. They envisioned a world where reason replaced superstition, equality replaced privilege, and justice replaced tyranny. Though not all these dreams were realized, they changed forever how humanity imagined its future. Part 19: The Enlightenment's Dark Side, Limits and Contradictions. The Enlightenment is often remembered as the Age of Reason, a time of progress, liberty, and human dignity. Yet like every era, it carried its contradictions and blind spots. For all its bold promises, the Enlightenment was not always applied equally, nor did it fully escape the prejudices of its time. Liberty and slavery. Perhaps the greatest contradiction was the coexistence of Enlightenment ideals and slavery. Philosophers declared that all men are created equal, yet millions of enslaved Africans were forced to labor in colonies that funded Enlightenment economies. While some thinkers like Condorcet and Montesquieu denounced slavery, others ignored or even justified it for economic gain. The Haitian Revolution later exposed this hypocrisy, proving that enslaved people themselves would claim the liberty the Enlightenment often denied them. Women left behind. The Enlightenment spoke of universal rights, yet women were largely excluded. Rousseau, for example, argued that women's primary role was to please men and raise children. While figures like Mary Wollstonecraft and Emily du Châtelet fought for intellectual recognition, the majority of women remained locked out of the freedoms their male counterparts celebrated. Class and inequality. Though the Enlightenment questioned aristocratic privilege, it rarely addressed the suffering of peasants and laborers. The rhetoric of equality often stopped short of true social transformation. Colonialism and the non-European world. Enlightenment Europe expanded its empires even as it preached liberty. Colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas were seen as resources for profit, not as equal partners. Many Enlightenment thinkers remained silent on, or complicit in, colonial exploitation. The tyranny of reason. Not all Enlightenment ideals led to freedom. In France, radical attempts to impose pure reason during the Revolution led to the Reign of Terror, where thousands were executed in the name of liberty. The pursuit of reason, without compassion or moderation, sometimes descended into cruelty. Faith and the marginalized. While deism and religious tolerance grew, outright hostility toward traditional faith often alienated those who still found comfort in religion. For many ordinary people, the Enlightenment felt distant, even threatening, to their way of life. Seeds of progress despite flaws. Yet even these contradictions left legacies. Women's rights movements, abolitionism, labor reform, and anti-colonial struggles would later use Enlightenment ideals as their foundation, pointing out that the Age of Reason had not yet fulfilled its own promises. The Enlightenment was not perfect. But even in its failures, it provided tools, reason, rights, and reform that future generations would wield to demand true equality. Part 20: The Legacy of the Enlightenment, Shaping the Modern World. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the Enlightenment's light did not fade, it spread, shaping the modern age in ways both profound and lasting. Though the movement had its flaws and contradictions, its legacy remains woven into the fabric of our world today. Political legacies. The Enlightenment's bold political ideas became the foundations of modern democracy. The American Revolution proved that governments could be built on consent, rights, and the rule of law. The French Revolution declared liberty, equality, and fraternity, influencing revolutions and reform movements across Europe and Latin America. The concepts of separation of powers, natural rights, and constitutional government remain at the heart of democratic systems today. Human rights and equality. The Enlightenment articulated the language of universal human rights. Though unevenly applied, its declarations inspired abolitionist movements, women's rights campaigns, and struggles against colonialism. Later generations invoked its ideals to demand the equality the Enlightenment itself had often denied. Science and education. The belief that reason and evidence could unlock truth became the cornerstone of modern science. Newton's laws, Lavoisier's chemistry, and Franklin's experiments with electricity laid the foundations for modern physics, chemistry, and technology. The Enlightenment also gave birth to the idea of universal education, planting seeds for public schooling and the notion that learning was a right, not a privilege. Culture and the arts. In literature, philosophy, and art, the Enlightenment left behind a legacy of clarity, balance, and human dignity. Neoclassical architecture still adorns capitals worldwide, and the music of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven continues to inspire centuries later. The idea of progress. Perhaps the most enduring Enlightenment legacy is the belief in progress, that humanity, through reason, compassion, and effort, could improve itself. This idea drove the abolition of slavery, the spread of education, the expansion of democracy, and the growth of human rights movements. A continuing conversation. The Enlightenment did not answer every question, nor did it achieve every dream. Its contradictions, slavery in an age of liberty, women's exclusion in an age of equality, colonialism in an age of rights, remain reminders of unfinished work. Yet the tools it gave us, reason, critical thinking, tolerance, and the belief in universal dignity, continue to guide the pursuit of a freer and fairer world. The light that never died. More than 2 centuries later, we still live in the shadow, and the glow, of the Enlightenment. Its thinkers dreamed of a world governed not by superstition or tyranny, but by reason and justice. Their vision reshaped nations, inspired revolutions, and continues to guide humanity toward a horizon of hope. The Enlightenment was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of modern history, a light that still shines, urging us to think, to question, and to believe in the power of human reason. While that is the end of our story detailing the long and descriptive history of the Enlightenment, we are not yet finished here tonight. We will now explore some fun facts regarding the Enlightenment period itself. Without further ado, let's jump in. The Enlightenment is often called the Age of Reason, emphasizing logic and critical thought over tradition and superstition. It spanned roughly the late 1600s through the 1700s, with echoes continuing well into the 19th century. The Enlightenment's roots lay in the scientific revolution, which proved that natural laws could explain the universe. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1687, was so influential that many Enlightenment thinkers described the universe as a giant machine governed by natural laws. Coffee houses in London were nicknamed penny universities, because for the price of a coffee, people could learn from debates and discussions. The salons of Paris, often hosted by women, became cultural centers where philosophers, scientists, and artists shared ideas. Voltaire was exiled multiple times for his outspoken criticism of the church and monarchy, yet his works were read across Europe. Denis Diderot's encyclopedia spanned 28 volumes and aimed to collect all human knowledge for the public. The Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, played a major role in the spread of scientific Enlightenment thought. Enlightenment thinkers were called philosophes in France, a term that meant lovers of wisdom. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, 1748, inspired the U.S. Constitution with his idea of separating powers. John Locke argued that humans are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, that governments must protect. Jean-Jacques Rousseau declared in The Social Contract, 1762, that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1776, introduced the idea of the invisible hand of the market, shaping modern economics. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, was deeply influenced by Enlightenment principles. The French Revolution, 1789, declared liberty, equality, fraternity, echoing Rousseau and Voltaire. The Enlightenment gave rise to deism, the belief that God created the universe but did not intervene in its workings. Many Enlightenment thinkers rejected miracles, emphasizing natural laws instead. Benjamin Franklin was a true Enlightenment man, a scientist, inventor, diplomat, and writer. Franklin's experiments with electricity, including the famous kite experiment, symbolized Enlightenment curiosity. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, described the Enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Kant's motto for the Enlightenment was Sapere Aude, Latin for dare to know. Mary Wollstonecraft argued in 1792 that women deserved equal education in her vindication of the rights of woman. Émilie du Châtelet, a French mathematician and physicist, translated Newton's work into French and expanded upon it. The Enlightenment encouraged the idea of universal education, though it was not yet realized for most people. The spread of cheap pamphlets and newspapers allowed ordinary people to engage with Enlightenment ideas. Freemason lodges became places where Enlightenment ideals of reason and fraternity flourished. The first public museums, such as the British Museum, founded 1753, reflected Enlightenment values of accessible knowledge. Smallpox inoculation spread in the 1700s thanks to Enlightenment science and advocates like Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Cesare Beccaria in On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, condemned torture and argued for proportionate punishment. Public executions, once common, began to decline under Enlightenment legal reforms. The encyclopedic mindset of the Enlightenment laid the groundwork for modern reference works like Wikipedia. In music, composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven embodied Enlightenment ideals of clarity and balance. Opera houses and concert halls became popular, making music accessible to wider audiences. The piano rose to prominence during the Enlightenment, replacing the harpsichord as the favored instrument of salons. Jacques-Louis David's paintings, such as The Death of Socrates, became icons of Enlightenment virtue and sacrifice. Many Enlightenment thinkers corresponded through letters that circulated widely, forming a republic of letters. The Enlightenment introduced the modern idea of public opinion as a political force. Censorship was common, but banned Enlightenment works often circulated clandestinely. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, was inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, led by Toussaint Louverture. The Enlightenment helped inspire the abolitionist movement against the transatlantic slave trade. Natural history thrived, with Carl Linnaeus creating the modern classification system for plants and animals. Enlightenment thinkers believed education could create better citizens, leading to new public schools in parts of Europe. Maps and atlases improved dramatically, reflecting global exploration and Enlightenment curiosity. Coffee and tea, once luxuries, became everyday staples linked with Enlightenment intellectual culture. Enlightenment science brought advances in astronomy, proving the solar system followed predictable laws. Many Enlightenment philosophers lived modestly but wielded immense influence through their writings. Thomas Jefferson, influenced by Locke and Montesquieu, called the Enlightenment a guiding star for American democracy. The Enlightenment encouraged secularism, promoting government separate from church control. By the end of the 18th century, the Enlightenment had reshaped Europe and the Americas, paving the way for modern society. The Enlightenment helped give birth to the concept of human rights, which became the foundation of later international law. Voltaire spent years in exile in England, where he admired the country's religious tolerance and free press. Coffee houses in London were so influential that King Charles II once tried to shut them down, calling them hotbeds of sedition. The encyclopedia was so controversial that it was banned multiple times, yet it sold thousands of copies in secret. The motto of the Enlightenment, Dare to Know, Sapere Aude, encouraged people to question authority and think independently. Many Enlightenment thinkers believed in progress, the idea that humanity could improve over time through reason and knowledge. Montesquieu's theory of checks and balances later inspired James Madison while drafting the U.S. Constitution. The Enlightenment championed reason over superstition, leading to new scientific societies across Europe. The term philosophe did not necessarily mean philosopher in today's sense, but rather intellectuals dedicated to improving society. Enlightenment ideas spread not only through books but also through plays, art, and even fashion, making them a cultural movement. Salons were often led by women, who acted as intellectual gatekeepers, deciding who and what was discussed. Freemasonry offered men from different backgrounds a space to debate Enlightenment ideas in secrecy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that children should learn through experience rather than strict discipline, a radical idea for his time. Beccaria's work on criminal justice directly influenced reforms in countries like Austria, Prussia, and the United States. Many monarchs, such as Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, styled themselves as enlightened despots. Enlightened despots supported reforms like education and legal codification, though they often resisted giving up power. The French Revolution's guillotine was originally introduced as a more humane method of execution, in line with Enlightenment ideas of justice. The American Declaration of Independence drew heavily on John Locke's natural rights philosophy. Many Enlightenment thinkers criticized organized religion, but few called for outright atheism. Voltaire's wit and biting satire made him one of the most quoted figures of the Enlightenment. The concept of secular government, separating church and state, was a direct Enlightenment development. Coffee and chocolate houses became fashionable venues for intellectual conversation. The Enlightenment fostered the idea of public libraries, making knowledge accessible beyond the wealthy. Benjamin Franklin helped found the American Philosophical Society in 1743, dedicated to Enlightenment principles of knowledge. The Republic of Letters was an informal international network of intellectuals exchanging ideas through letters. Candide, Voltaire's satirical novel, was banned for its criticism of authority, yet it became one of the most widely read books of the age. Mary Wollstonecraft's writings inspired later feminist movements, though she was often ridiculed during her lifetime. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, an Enlightenment-inspired pamphlet, sold 500,000 copies and fueled American independence. Enlightenment ideas encouraged the belief that government should be accountable to the people, not vice versa. Deism was appealing because it allowed belief in God without reliance on miracles or strict dogma. Immanuel Kant lived his entire life in Königsberg, yet his writings shaped philosophy across Europe. Many Enlightenment thinkers believed education should emphasize critical thinking, not memorization. The encyclopedia included entries on trades and crafts, not just philosophy, elevating the dignity of practical knowledge. Voltaire corresponded with Catherine the Great, advising her on reforms while criticizing European monarchies. Rousseau's writings on government influenced not only the French Revolution but also modern democratic theory. Adam Smith's economics laid the foundation for capitalism, but he also warned against unchecked greed. Scientific lectures were sometimes performed in theaters, drawing crowds like popular plays. The Enlightenment emphasized individualism, placing value on the rights and dignity of each person. Mozart composed his first symphony at age 8, embodying Enlightenment ideals of talent and creativity. Salons often mixed art, music, and debate, making them both social and intellectual hubs. Enlightenment thinkers believed in the universal applicability of reason, regardless of class, gender, or nationality. Many Enlightenment writings were banned books, circulated in underground networks. John Locke's philosophy also influenced educational reform, advocating for curiosity-driven learning. The press flourished, with newspapers and journals becoming key tools for spreading Enlightenment ideas. The Haitian Revolution shocked European elites, proving that enslaved people could apply Enlightenment ideals of freedom. Voltaire owned a large estate at Ferney, where he hosted intellectuals and ran a model village. The Enlightenment inspired early calls for animal welfare, questioning cruelty even beyond human society. Kant never traveled more than a few miles from home, yet he profoundly shaped moral and metaphysical philosophy. Enlightenment salons often featured public readings of banned works, fueling the thrill of forbidden knowledge. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment ideals had spread so widely that even absolute monarchs had to publicly acknowledge them. The Enlightenment is often credited with creating the modern concept of public opinion, something rulers could no longer ignore. Voltaire's personal library contained over 7,000 books, reflecting his endless curiosity. Denis Diderot's encyclopedia was contributed to by more than 140 writers, including scientists, philosophers, and craftsmen. Cesare Beccaриa's work on legal reform was admired by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and other American revolutionaries. Many Enlightenment thinkers believed education was the key to moral progress in society. Cafés in Paris were nicknamed parliaments of the people, where citizens debated politics openly. The encyclopedia included illustrations of machines and tools, showing the value placed on practical knowledge. Enlightenment thinkers often faced imprisonment or exile for their writings, yet their works still spread underground. Montesquieu believed climate influenced political systems, sparking debates on geography and governance. Salonières, women who hosted salons, wielded cultural and political influence despite lacking formal rights. Rousseau's book Émile revolutionized ideas about childhood, arguing children should learn naturally rather than by rote. The Enlightenment encouraged the rise of secular burial practices, moving away from exclusively church-controlled cemeteries. Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, and an efficient wood stove, all in the spirit of Enlightenment practicality. The U.S. Bill of Rights, 1791, was heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideals of individual liberty. Voltaire's play Mahomet criticized religious fanaticism, cloaking radical ideas in drama. Many Enlightenment philosophers self-published their works to bypass censorship. Adam Smith also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, emphasizing empathy and moral responsibility. Coffee and newspapers became inseparable, fueling morning debates in Enlightenment cities. Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, 1791, demanding equality during the French Revolution. Kant's philosophy distinguished between practical reason, ethics, and pure reason, metaphysics. The Enlightenment emphasized natural law, the belief that moral truths existed independent of religion. Many scientific experiments were performed in salons, turning intellectual debate into entertainment. Voltaire's remains were moved to the Pantheon in Paris in 1791, honoring him as a national hero of reason. Enlightenment-era scientific lectures often included electricity demonstrations, astonishing audiences. The Enlightenment saw the rise of learned academies, where ordinary citizens could compete in essay contests on philosophy and politics. The encyclopedia entry on cannibalism sparked scandal for challenging moral taboos. Rousseau's writings inspired both revolutionaries and later Romantic movements in art and literature. The Enlightenment spurred early discussions about universal human dignity, including the rights of prisoners. David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, questioned miracles and argued for empiricism, basing knowledge on observation. Locke's blank slate theory suggested people were shaped by experience, not born with fixed traits. Many Enlightenment thinkers were avid travelers, exchanging ideas across Europe. Madame Geoffrin's salon became so famous that monarchs sent her gifts to curry favor with intellectuals. The Enlightenment helped popularize the idea of progressive taxation to fund public services. Salons often mixed politics with music recitals, blending high culture and civic debate. Voltaire mocked aristocrats by saying nobility was nothing more than a man who got rich while his ancestor was hanged for theft. Enlightenment satire was dangerous. Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, 1729, shocked readers with its suggestion of eating children to solve famine. Scientific instruments like microscopes and telescopes became symbols of Enlightenment curiosity. Joseph II of Austria abolished torture and introduced limited religious toleration, earning the title of an enlightened despot. Enlightenment thinkers debated the morality of colonialism, though many still supported empires. Freemason lodges provided safe havens for Enlightenment discussions across Europe and the Americas. The term philosopher king gained popularity, imagining rulers who governed with wisdom and reason. Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, Mary Shelley, later wrote Frankenstein, a novel influenced by Enlightenment science. Enlightenment-era satirical cartoons often mocked monarchs and clergy, spreading ideas through humor. Enlightenment-era postal systems improved, fueling the spread of letters and pamphlets. Beethoven dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon, viewing him as an Enlightenment hero, until Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Scientific clubs and coffeehouses allowed amateurs to debate discoveries alongside professional scholars. Enlightenment thinkers often hid radical critiques in allegories, disguising political arguments as fables. Diderot once said, "Men will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest." Many Enlightenment salons were international, with guests from across Europe sharing ideas in multiple languages. The Enlightenment created the expectation that knowledge should serve the common good, not just the elite. The Enlightenment helped spark the abolitionist movement, with early activists calling slavery a violation of natural rights. Thomas Jefferson's library, filled with Enlightenment works, became the foundation of the U.S. Library of Congress. Denis Diderot spent 25 years working on the encyclopedia, despite censorship and threats. Voltaire spent years in exile in Geneva, where he used theater to spread Enlightenment ideas. Catherine the Great of Russia corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers, though she crushed uprisings that demanded too much liberty. The Enlightenment encouraged literacy among the middle classes, making reading a common leisure activity. Pamphlets were the social media of the Enlightenment, cheap and widely circulated. Salons were sometimes ridiculed by conservatives, who feared they gave women too much influence. Adam Smith believed governments should still regulate banks and defense, even while promoting free markets. Locke's philosophy on natural rights inspired movements for religious freedom across Europe and America. Enlightenment thinkers admired the ancient Romans and Greeks, seeing them as models of civic virtue. Opera in the Enlightenment often carried political themes, subtly criticizing rulers through allegory. Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro mocked aristocracy, echoing Enlightenment critiques of privilege. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography embodied Enlightenment ideals of self-improvement and rational living. Electricity experiments were performed as public shows, drawing curious crowds in European cities. Many Enlightenment texts were smuggled across borders disguised as harmless novels or religious books. Enlightenment children's literature began to emerge, with stories aimed at teaching morality and reason. Coffeehouses were sometimes called temples of reason, reflecting their intellectual character. Voltaire often used humor and satire because outright criticism of the monarchy could mean imprisonment. The Enlightenment expanded libraries, including the first major public lending libraries. Frederick the Great of Prussia once invited Voltaire to his court, though their friendship soured over politics. Rousseau argued that true freedom required obedience to the general will, a concept still debated today. The encyclopedia sold thousands of illegal copies, more than many official books of the monarchy. Women in Enlightenment salons often debated politics on equal footing with men, shocking traditionalists. The Enlightenment spread through universities, but also through taverns and workshops where pamphlets circulated. Some Enlightenment thinkers were imprisoned in the Bastille, including Voltaire. Immanuel Kant never married, devoting his life entirely to philosophy and writing. The Enlightenment introduced the idea of progress in history, that societies could steadily improve. Criticism of the Catholic Church was so common that censors banned entire categories of books. The encyclopedia included 72,000 articles, ranging from philosophy to metalworking. Locke's belief in the blank slate, tabula rasa, reshaped education, suggesting all children could learn given the right environment. Satirical plays and novels became popular ways to disguise Enlightenment critiques as entertainment. Voltaire's letters spread across Europe like wildfire, making him one of the most connected men of his age. Scientific societies gave public demonstrations of vacuum pumps, air pressure, and magnetism. The French Revolution adopted the Enlightenment motto, liberty, equality, fraternity. Mary Wollstonecraft was attacked by critics for being too radical, yet her ideas survived into later feminist movements. Public lectures in cities became so common that even artisans and laborers could attend and learn. Kant argued that morality required treating people as ends, not means, shaping later human rights philosophy. Voltaire is said to have written over 20,000 letters, a staggering reflection of his influence. The first encyclopedias for children were produced in the Enlightenment to spread knowledge early in life. Beccaria's ideas on justice helped inspire reforms in America's Constitution and Bill of Rights. Mozart was celebrated in his lifetime, but his works became even more influential after his death. The Enlightenment shifted burial grounds away from churches, promoting public cemeteries based on health and science. The scientific method became a defining feature of Enlightenment thinking, emphasizing evidence over tradition. Voltaire once invested in a lottery scheme, cleverly exploiting math to win large sums, funding his writing. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1789, was a direct Enlightenment creation. Some Enlightenment thinkers were deists, others agnostics, but nearly all emphasized rational faith. The Enlightenment encouraged the idea of civic virtue, where citizens had duties as well as rights. The Age of Reason was global, influencing independence movements in Latin America, Haiti, and beyond. By the end of the 18th century, the Enlightenment had redefined politics, science, education, and culture, leaving a legacy still alive today. Thank you for tuning into Background Historian tonight, and with those final fun facts, we will conclude our episode for tonight. I hope you are fast asleep, or at least approaching a state of deep rest, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Sweet dreams, and without further ado, good night.